Good morning. Excited now to spend some time in God's Word as we do each week, talk about a passage, what it means, why it matters, and what we should do about it. Very quickly, the observant among you will have seen a new series poster at the back. That will be our Advent series coming up called Prepare Him Room. Just really riffing on the idea of when we know a child is coming, we start to prepare a place for them because we're going to be welcoming this whole new person into our lives, and how do we get the room ready? Well, thinking this time about as we prepare for Christ's coming, who are we preparing for? What sort of preparations do we need to make for Him, and who is He going to be like when He comes? That's what we'll be focusing on in our Advent series starting again November 27th, so look forward to that. If you have a Bible with you, if you would turn to our passage that we're looking at today, which is Matthew 16, starting at verse 21. When you found that, if you're able, if you would stand together with me for the reading of God's Word, we will read together. When I'm finished, I'll say this is God's Word, and if you will, you can respond by saying, thanks be to God. Verse 21, Matthew says, "From that time, Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you.' But He turned to Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance or a stumbling block to me, for you are not seeing or not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.' And then Jesus told His disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with His angels in the glory of His Father. Then He will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom.'" This is God's Word. You may be seated. Let me pray once more for us quickly, and then we'll dive into this together. Spirit of God, would you just now open our eyes and hearts and minds to receive what you want to show us today? I believe you have a purpose, and I trust in you will accomplish it in each one of us. And as I always ask, eternal God, move and govern my tongue now to speak your truth. Amen. As his son embarks for Paris in Act 1, Scene 3 of William Shakespeare's masterpiece, Hamlet, the king's advisor, Polonius, ends a really kind of long, drawn-out farewell speech to his son with these well-known words, "This, above all, to thine own self be true. And it follows, as night follows the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." And it's good. I mean, it's good sort of fatherly advice for the most part. And if you think about it in light of the kind of cultural moment we're living in today, it's actually quite current. It's actually quite like modern advice. I doubt you'd need to spend more than, 60 seconds scrolling TikTok, Instagram, whatever, in order to find multiple posts with people championing the virtues of finding your true self, finally living in light of my truth, whatever it is. You're going to find a lot of these things today. And whether it's Polonius advising his son or the myriad of versions of this same advice that you're going to get from multiple people today, I think, generally speaking, we know what people mean when they say that, right? They're saying, we need to live and act in ways that are in line with, that are authentic to our boundaries, our beliefs, and values. As no question, a failure to do so over time can result in what many people describe as the death of self. But having said that, when you actually press someone, like really press them to say more, like what do you mean by that though? Like if Polonius' son, Laertes, had actually said to his dad after that, just being like, hey, thanks, Dad, but can I just ask you, like, what does that mean? What do you mean, be true to myself? How do I do that? Or even maybe more importantly, asked him, how do I know when I'm actually being true to myself and when I'm just trying to live out an idealized version of myself that's very often nothing more than a copying of someone else's self that I just happen to admire at the moment? How do I know when I'm actually doing it? Because that's the thing, right? And actually, at no other time in history has this question, what is my true self, been easier and simultaneously also more difficult to answer. Because in the past, the primary way you came to your sense of self was in relation to other people. Right? You look to others, family, friends, coworkers, God, whoever it is, to help you define yourself, help you understand who you were, whereas today, the primary place we look to answer that question is not out here. We look inward to ourselves, actually to the exclusion of anyone else who might want to, like, it's only you who can define your own true self, which means, as I said, now it's monumentally easier to answer that question, what is my true self? It's whatever you want it to be. Congratulations. But do you see it? Now, it's you don't have the ability anymore to test that theory outside of yourself with anyone. And then especially in today's day and age, nobody's going to challenge you on what you say. You're just going to get a lot of polite nods and smiles. How nice for you. You're not going to be able to fact check your conclusions because now we're left without any walls or edges with which to determine whether or not my self-determination of myself is correct. And I know there'd be people who, would hear me say that, they'd push back on that. They'd be like, well, listen, who are you to decide what's correct or not? If someone's saying that that's their identity, that's their true self, then it is. Okay, what my point is, I'm not talking about how anyone else sees my true self, my self-determination as correct. I'm not saying, does anyone else see this as correct? I'm asking, how can I tell myself, how can I assess my own assessment and whether or not it's correct with the complete absence of any way to fact-check my conclusions? Or to put it another way, just to kind of borrow from Polonius's words here, whether or not I'm being false to any other man, how do I know whether I'm being false to myself? And I bring it up as we continue in our teaching series this morning through Matthew's Gospel entitled Kingdom Come, because one of the key themes of this passage today is actually personal identity. What is my true self, as well as Jesus' answer to the question of how to rightly determine it. And we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into Jesus' answer to the question as we go here. But where you see Jesus actually posing the question is in verses 25 and 26, if you want to look there with me. You have Jesus saying, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? What shall a man give in return for his soul? It's not obvious at all in our English translations, but in the original language, every time you see the word life or soul in those two verses, it's actually the same Greek word, psyche, from which we get our modern English word psychology. The fact that the translators use the same word for life and soul in those verses isn't because they were confused or just indifferent, let's use this word this time. It's because the concept being described by that word is actually quite complex and difficult. It's hard to have just one word that describes everything. And as one commentator pointed out, it's actually if you've ever read Eugene Peterson's kind of modern-day paraphrase of the New Testament called The Message, the way he defines that term in this kind of modern paraphrase is psyche he actually describes as your true self, which I think is actually quite appropriate. I think that kind of grasps the whole concept of what's meant by psyche, which is something defined as separate from our physical self. So what I want to do is I want to spend a few minutes looking at this passage together with you, look at the way Jesus is helping us to answer the question, what is my true self? With the ultimate answer really being living my life in submission to the will of the one who made me and loves me. That's really Jesus' ultimate answer, but we'll flesh it out a lot more. So in order to understand and apply Jesus' answer, I want to look at this passage in just two ways. We're going to talk about Jesus' true sense of self, and then Peter's search for true self. Those two things. Jesus' true sense of self and Peter's search for true self. So if you close your Bibles, Bible app, whatever it is, would you open them again? I'd love you to follow along with me as we look through this together. As Jesus helps every follower of his to find their true self. Okay, so let's look first of all at Jesus' true sense of self. Jesus' true sense of self. And where you see this plainly is in verse 21 of our passage, if you look there with me. Matthew tells us, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised," which tells us a few things about Jesus. First of all, it tells us that he had a very clear sense of both his identity as well as his purpose, like why he'd come. He's very clear about what's going on for himself. In fact, most commentators pointed out that very clearly that we're beginning a new section of Jesus' ministry. He's starting out a whole new focus of ministry with those words, "from that time." You probably won't remember this, it was a while back, but in Matthew 4, right after Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, Matthew says, "from that time," and it begins Jesus' Galilean ministry. All his preaching and teaching and healing, that's the bulk of what we have in Jesus' life and ministry. But now here we have again, "from that time," beginning a whole new section where Jesus knows, my focus now is Jerusalem, where I need to go and to die. So he's very clear on who he is, his identity, as well as what he's come to do. It also shows us Jesus has divine foreknowledge of everything that's going to take place, both leading up to his death and afterwards. He can see the whole picture very clearly. And lastly, it shows us that along with having a crystal clear sense of himself, Jesus also wants his disciples to have a clear sense of who he is as well. A clarification, as we can see in the verses that follow, is obviously very much needed. And the timing of the clarification is actually quite critical, as if you remember last week, or if you weren't here, this is where, in response to Jesus' question to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter had given his famous confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So I think what Jesus is going on to do now, he's like, okay, great, good, you have a clear sense now of that I'm the Messiah. You've got that picture, but what you don't have yet is a clear picture about what kind of Messiah I am. Namely, I've come to be a suffering Messiah, a suffering servant who gives his life, not this kind of warrior king champion who's coming to take over Rome and get Israel back that you and so many of the Israelites believe. You've got it wrong. That's not the kind of Messiah I've come to be. Leon Morris puts it this way. He says, for the Jews in general, and presumably for the 12 up to this point, being the Messiah meant unadulterated glory. The Messiah, he might encounter opposition, even hardship, but this kind of thing was no more than an unpleasantness that must be passed through on the way to majesty and splendor. For Jesus, however, suffering was the essence of Messiahship. And from this point on, he brings it out again and again. So he wants them to know what kind of Messiah he is. But as we see now in verse 22, look here, Peter, hot off the revelation from God the Father that Jesus is the Christ, and clearly he's kind of like the spokesman here for the rest of the disciples. He pulls Jesus aside, and just kind of helps to set him straight. Because clearly his view of what the Messiah is supposed to be doesn't line up with Peter's view, right? So he tells Jesus there very very clearly, "Far be it from you, Lord." The actual translation is, "The Lord be merciful to you," which is like, God would never let that happen to you. This shall never happen to you. And it's hard in our kind of 21st century context right now to kind of get and really understand just how offensive and awful Peter's words and actions really are here, because we don't have these kind of rabbi-disciple relationships in our own day like they did in Jesus' day. But in this first century context, a disciple, he would never do this. He would never correct his master, never pull him aside, and certainly would never rebuke him, publicly or not. That just would never happen. And in light of who Peter had just confessed that Jesus is, it makes his rebuke all the more unthinkable. It's like, well, you just confessed he's the Christ, and now you're telling him he doesn't get it? D.R. Carson puts it this way. He says, Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah and then speaks in a way implying that he knows more of God's will than the Messiah himself. But this is just kind of Peter's MO, right? This is what he does. His heart, his passion very often runs ahead of his thinking and thought. That's description of Peter, and it's one of the things that's great about him, actually, and also causes him lots of trouble. But then, as if the scene weren't awkward enough already, rather than just simply ignore Peter's insulting questioning, just kind of brush aside his sort of inexcusable arrogance with maybe a stern glance, just like, Peter, that's enough. Instead, we see Jesus in verse 23 now. He turns to Peter in the presence of the other 11 disciples and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance or a stumbling block to me. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." Wow, okay. That must have been a bad day. I mean, here we have once again a response from Jesus that immediately brings some questions, as Jesus seems to be like really harsh in his response, really insulting. Just as remember back in chapter 15 when Jesus had responded to the Canaanite woman, initially we're like, wow, that's a lot. Same thing here. This feels like we don't understand what's going on. Like we want to ask, like, why is Jesus responding so harshly to Peter's kind of well-meaning mistake? Yeah, he doesn't see it right, but calling him Satan, that feels like a lot. And then it's like, is he literally saying you're Satan, or like you've been possessed by Satan? Like, what's going on? And the answer comes, first of all, in remembering the temptations that Jesus endured from Satan himself back in Matthew chapter 4, when he'd been led out into the wilderness there. There, if you don't remember, we have at least 3 temptations of Jesus recorded for us, where in every case, Satan's barely concealed purpose is to call Jesus to abandon the cross, to abandon the path of suffering in order and on the basis of who he was. Remember, he kept saying to him, if you are the Son of God, you shouldn't be hungry. If you are the Son of God, you shouldn't experience injury. If you are the Son of God, you shouldn't have to endure this awful will of your Father to gain the kingdoms of the world when I can grant them to you without suffering. And yet, as Morris again puts it so well, we're to understand that Jesus' death was so central to God's plan that to avoid it was to do the work of none less than the evil one himself. Indeed, Peter was essentially taking up the position of Satan in the temptation narrative. So no, it's not that Jesus is literally calling Peter Satan. It's more that like Peter's words and actions were exactly in line and in step with Satan's temptations in the wilderness. So that now Peter, this rock on whom the church would be built, that Jesus had said just moments earlier, had now become a stumbling block, a stone that would trip up Jesus. A stone that would cause Jesus to stumble over him if he listened to Peter's kind of kind-sounding diversion away from the path that he knew he must endure. But the other answer, as it relates to this first point in particular, is Jesus responds this way because he's so sure of his true self. He's so secure in his true identity, he's not only able to clearly define who he is and why he's come with great clarity, he's also able to defend who he is and why he's come, because he's so sure of who he is. Peter's rebuke is a potential diversion, a potential stumbling block to Jesus' purpose, and yet the clarity with which Jesus sees his true self and his true purposes allows him to remain steadfast now and walk the path that he knows that he must walk and suffer in Jerusalem. When it comes to our own lives, our own understanding of self today, what I think this first part of our passage shows us, not so much the how of finding our true self as the why understanding your true self is so important, why it's so needed for us to be able to do this. Because as we saw with Jesus, what having clarity about your true self does, it helps you both to determine your true purpose and values and boundaries, as well as to defend them. When you have clarity about these things. And it's a clarity we desperately need today because for so many followers of Jesus, myself included, we're so often distracted and diverted from the purposes that God has for us. We fall victim to these traps and stumbling blocks, not because we don't love Jesus, not because we don't want to be obedient to his word, but because we don't have clarity about who we truly are. We don't know what this true newly transformed identity that we have now in Jesus is, which is slowly being revealed, which, as I'm defining it, that is your true self. A lot of times we think true self in a Christian sense is I lose myself completely, I stop being who I am. Very much not the case. Our true self is who God created you individually to be in an increasingly sanctified version. That's the true self we're seeking to find. But clarity about who we are gives us clarity of purpose and direction, which then in turn gives us the ability to clearly see when something or someone is trying to divert us from that path, trying to call us away from that, which is why we need so much to know what that true self is. And yet, having said that, I just want to be very clear. What I mean by having clarity is not some kind of like brash, infallible certainty either. All right? That you come to this place where eventually you don't have anything more to work on, nothing more, no one can tell you anything else because you know who you are now. Jesus was the only one who had clarity like that. We're going to be in an ongoing process, a continual growth, which hopefully along with that growth, as we learn more of our true self, also brings along a lot of humility in the way we hold that picture of our true self. We need both of those things. Okay, so that's Jesus' true sense of self and why it's so important for us to seek that clarity for ourselves. The last thing I want to look at together with you is Peter's search for true self. Peter's search for true self. And we can tell right away in verse 22 that Peter doesn't yet have this clarified version of self. Why? Because clearly he's defending the wrong purpose. He's defending the wrong cause. Right? You got Peter rebuking Jesus, standing in opposition to the one that he just confessed moments earlier was the Christ, the Son of the living God, all the while defending his own understanding of what Jesus' purpose as the Messiah had to be. He's defending the wrong cause. And I'm saying that defending the wrong cause is a clear indication that Peter doesn't have clarity or clarified vision of his true self, because as we saw with Jesus, when you have a clarified vision of self, it leads you to defending the right causes. But maybe you'd say, okay, but isn't it? It's Jesus' sense of self that Peter doesn't have clarity about, not his own. To which I'd say yes, and also no. Because, no question, Peter has no place in his understanding for a suffering Messiah. And so he rejects Jesus' revelation of his true self and because it doesn't line up with his preconceived idea of who the Messiah is. But, man, this is something I don't think I ever saw before until this kind of time of reading and studying this passage. When you look at Jesus teaching his disciples in verse 25, he's talking about the one who seeks to save his life. In light of Peter's rebuke of Jesus just moments earlier, suddenly it made me wonder if the idea Peter also couldn't accept and understand was the idea of a suffering Peter. Clearly he can't fathom the idea of a suffering Messiah, but maybe he doesn't like the idea of a suffering Peter either, which I think we can all resonate with. Think about it. Peter's abandoned everything. He's abandoned his fishing business. He's left everything to follow Jesus because he believes he's the Messiah. He's now hitched his proverbial cart to, the very best horse in the universe. Future set now. Good. Okay, but if this vision of Jesus suffering and dying at the hands of the religious rulers, if that's right, what it also means is that Peter is going to suffer too. A fearful conclusion that Jesus terrifyingly confirms for Peter and the disciples in verse 24, plainly telling them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. I think we lose the weight of that. We lose the gravity of that in our modern day because we say so often phrases like, well, we all have our cross to bear. And usually we mean like traffic or something like that. But as D.A. Carson rightly notes, what any Jew in Palestine would know was that it was the man condemned to crucifixion who was often forced to carry part of his own cross. Taking up your cross was both a burden as well as a sign of death. Which altogether reveals that not only was Peter interested in saving Jesus' life, hence his kind of rebuke, Lord, this will never happen to you, he's also very interested in saving his own. And so what follows is Jesus' explanation, both to his disciples then as well as today, of what it looks like to embrace this path of suffering that Jesus knew himself he would walk in order to finally grasp both Jesus' true identity as well as their own. Again, beginning at verse 24 and following, look with me there. Jesus says this, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. He's saying, this is what it's going to involve to follow me. This is what it looks like. For whoever would save his life, remember that's psyche. Whoever would save his true self, and I think by there he means like our self-identification. Anyone who's going to cling to that is going to lose it. But whoever loses his psyche for my sake will find it. If you give up that self-determination, for me, you'll find it. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his true self? Or what shall a man give in return for his true self? And man, there's like truly so much actually in these two verses alone. Honestly, I feel like I could preach multiple messages just on these two verses. There's so much here. What I want to focus on our attention on in particular, though, is just three things, and we'll go through these quickly. What Jesus shows us here is the promise of suffering, the right practice of suffering, and then the prize of suffering. I worked really hard to alliterate those three things with P's. First of all, the promise. The promise of suffering, you see there in verse 24, like we said. Jesus says, anyone who come after him, want to be a disciple of his, must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. So that's a promise of suffering. My path is going to involve suffering, so will yours. And it's a dying to our self-determination of what life has to look like, and then a growing submission to my new true identity in Jesus. That's what he's talking and showing about. I love D.A. Carson says it perfectly here. Death to self is not so much a prerequisite of discipleship to Jesus as a continuing characteristic of it. This is an ongoing thing because remember, this is an ongoing process as we are learning and discovering more of that fully sanctified, perfected version of who God is making us to be. And I think honestly, it would be wrong to just rush ahead and not pause and acknowledge, at least initially, Jesus' promise here sounds hard, right? It sounds pretty unappealing, right? If you want to follow me, discover your true self, it's going to require giving up everything you know, all the things that you are familiar with and know, and oh, by the way, it's also going to involve suffering. Anyone? We're going to hand out clipboards to sign up for that. I wonder how many names we'll get on it. No, right? I think most of us are going to be like, I think I'm good, actually. I think I'm going to stick with my own self-determination, thanks. And yet the thing to remember here is that Jesus actually isn't calling us to any different experience than you're already experiencing. Right? Living in a fallen world, a broken creation as we do right now, we all experience suffering in life. That's not unique to followers of Jesus. Everyone experiences suffering in this life. What Jesus is calling us to is not a different experience, but a different result from the suffering that we all experience. Which is why Jesus goes on to clarify now in verse 25, showing us the right practice of suffering. Because if you read carefully, what Jesus does not say is, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will find it. That's not what he says. He says, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So much packed up in those three words that actually makes a world of difference to what Jesus is talking about here. Because again, suffering in life is something we all experience, but suffering that is experienced for, Jesus says, suffering you experience on account of me is something that brings both the blessing of God, that's the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, as well as a continued revelation in our lives of who God's created you to be. So the point is, it's not suffering in general that's going to reveal our true self. It's suffering for Jesus' sake as we have more of his identity and our true identity in him revealed to us over time. And that's a revelation that's worth giving everything in order to discover. As Jesus says, they're showing us the prize of suffering. You read in verse 26, showing us that there's actually nothing in this world that would be worth having in exchange for this revelation of our true selves. As he says, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul, his true self? What could someone give in return for their true self? Answer, nothing. There's nothing in this whole world, as if we could even attain that. But there's nothing that would actually be worth exchanging it for. I don't know where any of this finds you this morning, where any of this kind of like hits or lands or is resonating with you. But if you're at all like me, you kind of are reading this or hearing this and you think, okay, awesome. That sounds truly amazing to have both greater clarity of Jesus' identity as well as my own, and also to find true purpose in my suffering instead of just kind of the random purposeless experience of it. That sounds great. And yet, despite seeing the value, I mean, again, if you're like me, what you also feel is that, but I could never experience that. I'm so far gone. I've like screwed up so much. I'm so scattered and all over the place. There's no way that I could ever pursue this in a way that I'd actually see results. I would be kicked off of the true self-discovery program pretty shortly after I started it out. I wouldn't be able to make it. And yet something else I noticed for the very first time in studying this passage again this week, and I want to show you this as we close. It's really given me confidence to continue to press into this and keep trying, is the way Jesus responds to Peter's epic failure here in this passage in verses 24 and following. Because yes, verse 23, Jesus rebukes even the well-meaning reprisals of Peter because they mirror the temptations to abandon the purpose that Jesus knew he had to experience, just like he had from Satan himself. And yet, if you notice, at no point does Jesus say to Peter, okay, you know what? Wow. There's been a lot of screw-ups up till this point, and now this is really bad, Peter. You know what? I'm sorry to tell you this. I don't think it's going to work out. I just don't think that you're just not ready for the program here. Sorry, Peter, you're actually out. This is like Gordon Ramsay, take off the jacket, you're off the team. Sorry, it's not going to work out for you. You're not ready. Does anybody see that in this passage where Jesus does that to Peter? No, right? Instead, what you see is Jesus graciously pushing the pause button, pushes a reset, gathers everyone in, and creates space for failure so that Peter can actually learn from what he's done wrong and try again. That's the kind of environment where this happens. And maybe that doesn't resonate with you, but when I think of my own life and the number of times I've got my approach to Jesus wrong, the number of times I've sought to cling to my own self-determination rather than submit to Jesus, the number of times that I've just wrongly tried to avoid suffering rather than embrace it as a tool to help reveal my true self. What it shows me is that when I've failed like Peter fails here, epically, and I have failed epically, I'm still not cut off. I'm still not off the team. There was a study done years ago by a woman named Amy Edmondson in hospitals where she did a study in order to help prevent medical errors. And while it initially looked like hospitals that created a safe place for people to fail saw more errors, what the study revealed in the end was that environments that created a safe place for failure in order to learn from those mistakes actually created less errors in the long run. It's only that work environments where it wasn't safe to report errors, where you thought you were going to lose your job, people just simply didn't report them. So there are actually way more errors in these environments where it's not safe to kind of say, hey, I didn't do this right here. Patient wasn't cared for properly. It didn't do this right. And to learn from that, way more errors in the place where it wasn't safe to do that. And they just continued to keep repeating the same errors because there's no point, there's no way to learn now. You read a lot in leadership materials right now about creating psychological safety in workplaces. Where failure is seen as an understood and expected part of how you operate because you're asking your employees to actually take risks, to try new things instead of just doing it the same way all the time, and then learning from what doesn't work. What I want us to see here, and what I draw immense encouragement from myself personally, is that 2,000 years before Amy